Hello, everyone. As the inaugural director of the Elahé Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto, I welcome you all to today's session of Literature in Persian Language Pedagogy, featuring Professor Kamran Cross of University of Michigan and Professor Matthew Thomas Miller of University of Maryland, who will be speaking on reintroducing the classics, teaching classical Persian through the works of Sa'di. We are grateful to Professor Cross and Miller for accepting our invitation and joining us today virtually. Literature in Persian Language Pedagogy series is co-convened by my brilliant colleagues, Professor Pune Shabani Jadidi of the University of Chicago and Professor Azita Talaqani of the University of Toronto. The series is also co-hosted and co-sponsored by the University of Chicago's Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations and the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, as well as the University of Toronto's Department of Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations. We appreciate their institutional support. I also thank the Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute for generously funding the creation of the Elahé Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. At the outset, I like to express our personal and collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the Elahé Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies is located. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and more recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous communities across Turtle Island, and we are grateful for the opportunity to live, learn, and teach on their ancestral land. Professor Azita Talaqani will introduce our speaker, and Professor Pune Shabani Jadidi will moderate the session. Professor Talaqani.
Thank you, Professor Tawakkoli. We are also grateful for the support of Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies, Dr. Mir-Djalali, and the director of the institute, Professor Mohammad Tawakkoli Tarqi, for his constant support. I would be honored to welcome Professors Kamran Cross and Matthew Thomas Miller to the University of Toronto and our webinar series. Professor Kamran Cross is Associate Professor of Iranian Studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. His research interests include the comparative study of medieval narrative and fictionality, practices of adaptation and performance, and the theoretical prisms of gender, animal, and monster studies. Professor Matthew Thomas Miller is Assistant Professor of Persian Literature and Digital Humanities at Roshan Institute for Persian Studies at the University of Maryland College Park and Affiliate Faculty of the Maryland Institute for Technology in the Humanities and the Religious Study and Comparative Literature programs. His research focuses on Persian literature, Sufism, the history of affect emotion in the Islamicate world, digital humanities, and literary cultures of Middle Eastern revolutionary movements. My friend and colleague, Professor Pune Shabani Jadidi, will moderate today's session on reintroducing the classics, teaching classical Persian through the works of Sa'di. Please join me in welcoming Professors Cross and Professor Miller to our webinar series. Professor Cross and Professor Miller.
I see the. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's such a lovely occasion to be among friends. I've seen a lot of dear friends and colleagues who I haven't seen for a long time on the screen, and so it's great to see you all, and thank you for this opportunity. Matt, do you want to say anything too? We'll walk you through our format in just a moment, but I don't want to jump the gun here.
No, I mean, please go ahead.
Okay. So this is also a pleasure because it's a collaborative effort, and we'll be co-presenting this work, and we are really excited to hear your thoughts and suggestions as we go forward with this. We decided the best way to offer a not so bumpy ride through the material is for me to offer some context and some background to it, and then Matt will walk you through some of the practical applications of this method. So just to make sure, you can all see the slides okay?
Yes.
Okay, then I will jump forward. So this is when this invitation came in, it was actually very fortuitous because Matt and I had been talking about doing something to introduce and help teach classical Persian for students for quite some time. There's some background behind this that we can share, which is, of course, that it's getting increasingly difficult to find places to study classical Persian. Regrettably, a lot of programs simply it gets harder and harder to justify small classes, for example, or to recruit graduate students. The cohort sizes tend to be shrinking. And so even when we do have graduate students studying classical Persian, we found in our experience that it tends to be like very small 1-2 person seminars that university administrations don't really like. And in addition, there's a very, very rich body of material, and yet it's somewhat, at least in my experience, diffuse. You have to do some digging and some synthesis to kind of create your own understanding of what's out there and how to go through it systematically. So we thought maybe we can start to offer a sort of refresh. We're not reinventing the wheel by any means, but rather to take what's out there and give it a coat of paint and perhaps make it accessible in some sort of open access format for a general user. And the idea is then, could we use this sort of textbook, so to speak, this reader/textbook, in a way that, again, would be available to anybody with an internet connection to use as a complement to whatever grad programs they may be in, if they happen to be in a graduate program that offers classical Persian, or could you use it as a baseline for collaborative learning outside the framework of a specific institution? And a model that comes to mind very readily for me is Old Persian and Middle Persian, which again, people who want to study those languages usually can't do it through standard course offerings at any institution. And Prozox or Shervo has very generously created these little readers and introductions to Old Persian and Matt Pahlavi, where you can download them, go through them yourself, create self-study groups, or meet with him or other people who are experts in the field via Zoom to get a handle on the text that you want. Is there anything you wanted to add to this background, Matt?
I mean, I think the starting assumption for us is that we wanted to create something that both could be used in a classroom. Like, I mean, I think actually this conversation initially started between Cam and I when, Cam, you were teaching classical Persian texts in a kind of one of these small class sizes at University of Michigan, which, is one of only a handful of places anymore where you were actually even able to do this. And so we started this conversation around his class, and I said, I've been working on this high frequency reader model with Maxim Romanov, and I shared it with him. He took it, and I think you took it to your students, and we can perhaps talk a little bit more how they responded to it later when I walk you through that. But I think we have to be very realistic too, that we should perhaps start thinking about, well, what would be how would we be able to help students learn this who are at universities where they may not be able at all to get this kind of training, because either A, there's not someone there who has enough of an academic specialization in pre-modern Persian to teach it properly, or B, what Cam pointed to earlier, that because of the institutional context of higher ed, especially increasingly in the last year, where funding models are under assault and where all those pressures that are on the higher level administrators are increasing even more than they have been in the past. It just is becoming less and less likely that this model of kind of like the small class of graduate students learning how to basically read pre-modern Persian, it just becomes less and less tenable. And so if that's the case, what do we need to do now to prepare for that? And as Cam said, there are other languages, other less commonly taught languages that have struggled with, these exact same kind of things. And are there ways in which we can kind of prepare for that? So that was, for us, I think, like the motivation. And yeah, Cam, I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah. So when we're thinking about what the main goals of such a approach, of like a pedagogical approach, would be, it is definitely not the four skills of reading, listening, speaking, and what's the last one? Reading, listening, hearing, and writing. We basically want to enable students to read classical texts, but I think pedagogically, hearing the texts is essential, and learning how to recite them well is also essential. But the foundation of this is sort of like, let's work through classical texts and use that as the teaching methods or the teaching materials. Another important thing is to become, if you want to go say that you have a handle on classical Persian literature, it's important to know the canonical authors. And of course, I think it's important to keep a critical eye to the fact that canons are historical and change, and we should be aware of that historicity. But there's a very practical value in reading some of the really famous authors, Ferdowsi, Nezāmi, Sa'di, Hafez, and so on, Maulana, simply because they're so widespread that enables you to catch intertextual references and stylistic callbacks or imitatio, istiqbal, when it's happening. If you took a completely like sort of anti-hierarchical approach, you may actually miss out on some just important intertextual voices. But the ideal here is to build a baseline competence that would enable you to then just go out in any direction you want and feel like you have a handle on whatever text you're reading, knowing that, of course, individual authors will have their own style and various genres have their own conventions, but ideally something to get you started. We are assuming that any student approaching this has at least some elementary or even intermediate modern Persian, so they can read, they know the modern grammar rules, and they can recognize common nouns and verbs. If you have that basis of knowledge, there's a certain number of challenges that we tend to find when we teach classical. There's a lot of grammar that is sort of taught in a fairly reified way in modern Persian. It still applies, but it's a lot looser and a lot kind of more open. That you have to kind of unlearn a little bit and relearn. Of course, the vocabulary base can be quite different from modern Persian. And in a tricky manner, sometimes the familiar words, or the words that you've read before in a newspaper, have very different semantic meanings in the classical context. And so there's like kind of, again, a bit of unlearning or relearning around the broader usage of words across time. Bilingualism is something that, of course, Ottomanists also think about, as far as like how do you, short of like having students go through a complete program of Arabic study, how best to integrate Arabic language competency to be able to recognize certain forms and patterns into a Persian curriculum is something on our minds. And then finally, I mentioned genres, forms, conventions. Just being familiar with or learning about what are the conventions of a qasideh, for example. Prosody is another big challenge that, in my view, the more you are able and comfortable with working with meter, that will really, really help scholars from making translation mistakes or that sort of thing. But for some students, it could be like kind of this strange, mysterious science. So finding ways to teach prosody in accessible ways is another goal, or is a challenge that we're trying to address. To unpack a few of these, I don't know if we need to go into too much detail, but some examples of rules that often come up are that you find unmarked verbs in classical Persian. That are sometimes called aorist verbs, and they have a certain range of meaning that you don't really find in modern Persian. The mi prefix, on the other hand, has a much broader, more floaty sort of presence, where it can be hani as its own piece, or it can be attached to the end of the verb. like raftani, that sort of thing. You'll find this be attached to verbs, be kard, be raft, be shod, that sort of thing. The ra, as I'm sure is well known, is also a challenge, because you learn in modern Persian, you learn ra as a direct object marker, but of course it can be a much more open marker of obliqueness, indirectness, dative, genitive, that sort of thing. For example, like the modern Persian kitab ra darad would be, you could say something like ura kitab ast, unto that person is a book. Which we do find in modern Persian. I like to point out how phrases like chan salate or khaban mibare, these are also, these encode the ra, that older form of ra, into modern Persian in ways that I did not understand for a long time as a student of modern Persian. Like, for example, khaban mibare, I would try to understand this as a genitive, like my sleep is carrying, and it didn't occur to me that you could read Hab Mara Mibarad, for example, or Chansal Torah asked, right? How many years are unto you, are yours, in this genitive or dative form. We know that the syntax can be much more scrambled than in the kind of the standard conventions of modern Persian. Ezafe has a huge range of motion of meanings. As my teacher Saeed Yusuf would say, there's the ta is the tayyibiham ta. There's so many ways that word can be used. Other words like chun, ke have new meanings, and so on. I mentioned the semantic shift, and a few common ones that I can mention are words like dolat, chaste, andishe, shodan. These are words that you would recognize, but if you read like the Sarve Azad, for example, as the free Cyprus, that would be kind of confusing. So you have to learn this new range of meanings within words. And then finally, for genres, forms, and conventions, I think the Qasideh is a really good example. The Qasideh has so much of a convention built into it that if you simply dive into a Qasideh without knowing its conventions, its various movements, from the nasib, for example, to the mad, it can be really confusing. And so it's helpful, I think, a good introduction ought to orient readers to what to expect in various genres, forms, and modes. Now, the inspiration, again, Matt mentioned Maxime Romanov, who's a mutual friend and acquaintance and colleague of ours, who's been tackling a similar question with Arabic. And as you know, Arabic has a very, very complex grammar. And one way that one could approach it is to say, all right, let's go down and go through a systematic breakdown of all the forms of, every single way you can make a jussive in Arabic verbs, which is very daunting. It takes a long time, and it's very theoretical in some ways. And Maxime, when thinking about this issue, thought like, well, why not just read texts, starting with the really, really common forms that one might find, and just because that's when you start to recognize patterns and common verbs and that sort of thing in a way that allows you to kind of start at the center and move out. So his method was to find, using machine-assisted tools, word like short hadith, for example, like the one in front of you, where we see فَقَالَ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ مَنْ أَحَقَّ بِحُسْنِ صَحَابَتِي قَالَ أُمَّكَ قال ثم من أمك ثم من قال أمك قال ثم من قال أمك قال ثم من قال ثم أبوك. Right? So just قال ثم من, like very simple verbs, very simple nouns. And if you start with this, you could have a student reading classical Arabic within 15 minutes, and then you can start saying, all right, let's see some more verbs out of this, or more, you sort of build on that foundation. So you can see his project here, and we're sort of building on that foundation. The advantages with this sort of approach then is that you're not memorizing every single form a Persian verb can take, as you often see in certain grammars, like those charts and charts, right, of every single iteration of a verb form. You just see very common verbs like kar, goft, dod, that sort of thing. And you immediately start getting familiar with the most common nouns and idioms that you're likely to find in classical Persian. Which oftentimes carry through from writer to writer. Meters are also an interesting case of this. If you look at a theoretical outline of every single meter possible in Persian poetry, it's quite daunting, right? Like Elwell Sutton's book, it just gives like this huge list of forms, but he notices in his research that about 5 patterns account for about 90%, if not more, of the poems that one finds in a divan or anthology, that sort of thing. And so again, you can just start with the most common things and then build out, rather than teaching the theory of how to scan for any meter under the sun, and then sort of draw from this huge grab bag of potential matches to try to find the one that fits. If you know that very likely a given poem is going to be either in like Hazaj, a form of Ramal, Mozare, or Mutaqarrib, then you can probably find your meter pretty quickly. I'll pause for a moment because I've been sort of talking. Is there anything you wanted to add, Matt?
I mean, I think the only thing that I might throw in here is that the idea is built on what, I mean, you actually see in a lot of books that teach modern Persian or modern Arabic or any other, foreign language, is that they very systematically build from a base of common words up and out, so that you enable the reader or the learner to scaffold up, so that they're not kind of just like thrown into a huge mass of text in which you may be learning very, very idiosyncratic words or potentially grammatical constructions, and which sometimes can be frustrating if you're bouncing from less common thing to less common thing. It gives you this sense that you're drowning in the sea, whereas if you actually work and scaffold up from what is most common and then deal with the edge cases, as Cameron was giving the example of meters, for example, if you can work with the student on these 5 metrical patterns, and then as they master those and then encounter other ones that maybe don't fall into that, they're able to develop a more solid base. And I think like that's what we're trying to do with these readers, with these lessons that we'll show you an example of later, is say, okay, if you as a learner of pre-modern Persian, you're really interested in starting to read epic literature. Well, then let's start out by having you do 10 lessons that are built around the 10 passages in the Shāhnāma, or Visu Ramin, to take Cam's example, and really learn what are the most common things that you're going to encounter in reading this text, so you can get the learner's confidence up and you can get them off and running much more quickly by scaffolding them in a very systematic way. And we can perhaps talk a little bit more about how the kind of high frequency approach does that a little bit later.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the idea here is to see if we can use certain machine or computer assisted tools or methods to build that basis of identifying the nouns, verbs, and forms that you're most likely to encounter, and then to, again, rather than describe like uses of raw in a kind of abstract manner, just to show simple examples, such as you might find in a hikayat by Sadi or something, showing the raw in work, the various ways it could be done. And through that basis, again, with a scaffolded approach in mind, to just give you a foundation that you then have the confidence to dive into a new text and not feel like you have no idea what's going on. Now, the question was where to start. And very quickly we can add, and what I'm about to show you kind of proves this in an interesting way. You should not start with Ferdowsi, even though Mutaqarrib is not the most daunting of meters. But it turns out that Ferdowsi, as an example, is a very distinctive author. He kind of has a style that one can learn if you're interested in epic literature. But because Ferdowsi is not going to necessarily help you read the whole breadth of Persian literature that well, a good reader might not want to take a chronological sequence. In some ways, if you're offering some sort of historical account of the various kind of eras of Persian literary development, that's handy, but it may not be the best way to arrange the material pedagogically speaking. Our idea then and this is kind of common sense, it's not like, oh, this is so brilliant, is maybe Sadi might be good. Naturally, because he's, as Frank Lewis wrote, he's probably the single most influential, or his Golestan is probably the single most influential work of prose in the Persian language. And Sadi's Divan is often, or Sadi as a author of Ghazal is again, I'm thinking of Shahla Farghadani's work. In many of the Taskades, Sadi is identified as the founder of the Ghazal, right? It's that influential, that impactful. And we know that the Golestan was used as a textbook in Ottoman and Mughal territories, and was also used as a primer for Persian in British India. So there's a huge body of resources, commentaries, grammars, etc., built around the Golestan and Sadi's work more broadly that we could draw from. So it just is sort of like a natural place to consider, as like probably he's a good place to start with. But it might be interesting to sort of look a little bit more carefully to see if our hunch is correct. And if so, where would we start with Sadi? Would it make more sense, for example, to start with the Bustan, where you have a regular meter, and then learn like that way you master the mutaqarrib, and then you can move into other things? Or would a different text make sense? And so the way to explore this, or one way of exploring this, is with stylometry, which is where you basically, it's kind of complex in some ways, but the basic idea is very simple, where you basically have machines scan a huge corpus of text to see what are the most common words and word sequences used. This technique has been used in various contexts to look for authorial attribution, to guess at the identity of an author. Fortunately, we don't really need to worry about that stuff. It can be, if we're just simply scanning for common words, it's just a very useful tool to find what the most common words are and find texts that furnish that core vocabulary. And the data set that we were using is all thanks to the Roshan Initiative of Persian Digital Humanities. Matt, I feel like I should have you do the honors talking about this slide, because this is very much the project you've been working on for quite some time.
Yeah. I mean, I can say a little bit about it. I mean, the texts that we used were actually done. I mean, it's like good timing actually, because we just got this large gift from the Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute to do a proper Persian digital library. But the actual seed of the Persian digital library project that we will really be developing and rolling out over the coming 2 to 3 years started back in 2017, 2018 with this Persian digital library pilot project, in which, basically what we did is we took the different texts that are available online, mostly from Ganjur at that time, and we tried to work with the current encoding options that were available at the time to encode them in ways that would make them machine actionable. So we put them in TEI XML, made them CTS compliant, so that they would be able to, for example, be displayed in the kind of latest digital viewers that were available at the time. It also made them able to be used in different forms of computational textual analysis programs like Stylo, which is what Cam will show you some of his kind of research and exploratory data analysis using Stylo in just a second. But I will just say, before I turn it back to Cam here, that this was very much a pilot project, and actually really the seed for what has become this much larger project that we'll be working on in the coming years.
Yeah, so there's some huge caveats that we can start with. First of all, I should highlight that most of the corpus that we have right now is in verse. And of course that skews it to a degree. Thankfully, more and more prose works are getting digitized, but right now this is just sort of by nature of the corpus we're using, skewed towards what are the most common words and constructions one will find in verse forms rather than prose. A few other things that I've limited myself to, partially to just make the data legible, is to only draw a sample of major authors, mostly from the 16th century, or from up to the 16th century. It'd be very important and interesting to include a full without millennium-long history. But since we're thinking, and already what we'll see in a moment is that the stylistic changes are quite dramatic as we move into the early modern period. So it may well justify multiple readers, right, to offer competency in various time periods. But there's a lot to do. Matt and I were discussing about one thing that has yet to be done, for example, is just to establish a baseline of what are the best parameters to use when doing these searches. So I am a total beginner in this stuff, and I was simply looking to see what might pop out as in response to this question of like, is Sadi a good choice for this work? To give you a quick overview then of what we're about to see, these are the works and authors represented, ranging again from basically the beginning of the 11th century up to the 16th century. Saib is a little bit later. But yeah, we're basically looking at that kind of Ferdowsi to Jāmi sort of spectrum. I'll pause here, but then move forward. And so I'm going to run you through a couple examples of what came up when I started looking for connections between texts. So Style is a program that tries to cluster texts based on their similarity to each other in terms of their word usage. And this is kind of very interesting to do if you're interested in genre analysis, for example. And what you're seeing right now is a cluster analysis of this corpus based on the most 100 frequently used words. So it's not super accurate, but it's good at resisting noise. And I know this is very small, and if you're interested in seeing any of these more detailed, I can bring up the images at the end of the presentation. But I'll just walk you through what I found as I was looking at these. If you're looking at the only top 100 words, you'll find that the prose works, Hojviri, the Shāhnāma, and the Tazkirat al-Awliya, understandably fall into their own category. Then in the second cluster, we see Sa'di's Divan, the Divan of Hafez, and the works of Maulana and Attar. The third category clusters Ferdowsi, Nezāmi, Jāmi, and Sa'di's Golestan and Bustan. And then finally, we have Anbari, Rudaki, Farokhi, and Sana'i in the fourth cluster. To compare that with so the parameters here are very important. They can really change what pops out. So as a second experiment, I looked at what happens if you scan for the 1,000 most frequent words, which is more accurate because you're just digging deeper, but you can also get more noise affecting the outcome. But again, nothing was too surprising in some ways. Again, prose works had their own cluster alongside Obeid Zalkani's Musho Gorbe and the Shiro Shekar of Sheikh Baha'i, which is kind of interesting. But then the second cluster number 2, has pretty much all of the narrative Masnavis that one might expect that sort of sit together in a cluster. You have a cluster of Jāmi unto himself, a cluster of Nezāmi and Amir Khosrow as a group, and then finally Ferdowsi and Gorgani as a cluster. Again, which makes sense because, Ferdowsi and Gorgani have their own rather archaic style in comparison. And we know how close Amir Khosrow is interested in the works of Nezāmi. And then finally, with the third cluster, we have Shahristari, Attar, Khayyam, and Sana'i. These are all clearly didactic poets. And then finally, the kind of divans of Obeid, Sadi, Hafez, Salman, Salfaji, and Khaghani, Maulana, and so on are a cluster. So you can see that this seems to group texts in ways that make sense. So as a final experiment, I decided to split the difference and look at the 500 most frequent words to see if anything else came up. Again, the prose texts form their own cluster, along with Musho Gorbe. The divans, here in number 2, form their own cluster. So this is telling us that divan literature has its own distinct vocabulary set. The romance epic continuum with subclusters in Jāmi, Attar, Nezāmi, and Amir Khosrow, and Ferdowsi, plus the Alexander romances. So, for example, by that I mean like the Shārāfnāma and the Iqbālnāma of Nezāmi, or the Āyīn-e Iskandari of Amir Khosrow. So anything about Alexander basically sits in proximity to Ferdowsi, which is interesting. And then finally, the didactic poets, Sana'i, Maulana, Sadi, apparently, in this case, we can think of Sa'di as a didactic poet. So to sum up that data, it seems that prose works form their own cluster, that narrative Masnavis form a broad spectrum with clusters around Ferdowsian epic, Alexander stories, love stories, and the exemplars especially being Layli Majnun, Khosrow and Shirin, and Yusuf az-Zulaykha, and finally homiletic works in the style of Attar or Molana. The Divan literature tends to form its own cluster. Interestingly, though, the Golestan, the Bustan, and the Masnavi sometimes get clustered in with the Divan literature. And I think this is an important note to highlight. We'll see it pop up in another view, which I'll share here. Another way of sort of looking at relationships between texts, rather than the cluster analysis, is called the principal component analysis. And that gives you a sense of kind of where's the center and where's the periphery in terms of word usage. What are the kind of the words that are that best represent the words that you might encounter in a random piece of classical Persian literature, and what works are very distinctive in their own style. So I'm only basically changing the output from the clustering to this principal components analysis. All the parameters are the same, but it produces pretty interesting results. So if you go to the principal cluster analysis of the 100 most frequent words, you can see that basically all the work is here, up and down this vertical axis, except for, would you know? The prose texts. That's pretty small. That's not Sere Khosrow's Shāhnāma is way out there. Why? Because he's talking about architecture and ceremonies and a very different kind of set of themes than what you'd find in this stuff. A bit closer is Attar and Hojviri, because they're interested in Sufism. And then you get basically everything else along this axis. So what we learned from this actually is that it's not necessarily just prose that is going to cluster distinctly from poetry, but rather it's the theme and the topic, quite understandably. So the Golestan is right dead center because thematically and topically it's talking about the same stuff as all these other texts, unlike Nasr Khosrow. So now let's scale up a little bit to 500 most frequent words. So this is our middle ground. And this is, for me, really interesting. And I'll walk you through the quadrants as they emerge. So in this quadrant, quadrant A, we find Sheikh Bahā'i, Shahristari's Gulshan Raz and similar works, and the work of Sana'i, kind of around this thing. Sheikh Bahā'i is the farthest out. In quadrant B, you have the Mahsan al-Asrar of Nezāmi, the Matla al-Anvar of Amir Khosrow, and the Tuhfat al-Ahrar of Jāmi, showing again like there's a certain style that sets these texts, obviously they're in conversation with each other, into a certain kind of stylistic quadrant. And interestingly, between those two, between the work of Sana'i and Shahristari on one side and these, what would you call them? They're not specifically about Sufism, but they are advice works, adab works, right? Between those two is where you get the Divan literature. So the Divan work, in terms of its vocabulary usages, is sort of between the Divan specifically of Attar, Hafez, Sa'di, Iraqi, Molana, are between these two kind of thematic quadrants. Then when you go down to C, it's basically the prose text. There's the Tazkirat al-Awliya, the Kashf al-Mahjub, and the Shāhnāma. So no surprise here, prose again. And then in the fourth quadrant, you get Ferdowsi way out there at the end. So this shows that Ferdowsi has a very, very distinct style that's not very common, or it doesn't overlap very well with everything in the middle. And then when you move up, you see Asadi Tusi, who's of course writing a Ferdowsian epic. And then you see Nezāmi's Shāhnāma and Khirātnāma, so the Alexander stories, Khosrow and Shirin's in here, then Half Peykar. And as you go up, I'm sort of showing the digression in this with these arrows. You move from Ferdowsi to the Alexander stories, to the Half Peykar stories, to Khosrow and Shirin, and finally to Layli Majnun up here at the edge, right when you're bumping up against the works of like the Divans of Attar, Hafez, Sa'di, and the Mahsan al-Asrar and so on. And again, between these two quadrants, you see the Divans of court poets like Farahi, Rudaki, and Masudi Sa'd Salman. So you start to seeing a kind of layout of a map of genres, showing not only where the clusters are, but how they relate to each other, where the Venn diagram overlaps. The last, I promise this is my last chart to walk you through. I was curious to see what happens if you do 1,000 words. Quadrant A, again, shows the same progression. Ferdowsi's way out there. He's his own kind of distinctive style. Then to Asadi, then Rudaki, because he's archaic. Then Amir Khosrow, the Shāhnāma and the Iqbālnāmah. So we're moving into the Alexander stories and the half-pekar stories. Further in, you see Viso-Ramin, the half-pekar. And then finally, as you get to the end, you get to Khosrow and Shirin down at the bottom. And then as you keep going down, you see the Mahsan al-Asrar, the Layli Majnun, and Yusuf and Zulaykha stories, and then the Khosrow and Shirin again. I'm starting from the bottom and moving in. Oops, sorry. So you see, again, this sort of blend of a generic blend from, shall we call it, Ferdowsian epic all the way down to Khosrow and Shirin, or sorry, to Yusuf and Zulaykha, or the Mahsan al-Asrar, with like the kind of courtly romances of Khosrow and Shirin at that middle point. This is where the two genres kind of fuse together. On quadrant C, we have the prose works again, all out here in the edge. Then the works of Attar and Molana, the Masnavi. And then down here again, you have the Divan literature. It's all its own corpus. And Sa'eb, interestingly, is way out there. So we can see that the divans of all these classical poets are in conversation with each other, that there's a spectrum of narrative that sort of runs from Ferdowsi to a kind of something like in this model of Mahsan al-Asrar, and then works on Sufism start to blend with the divan down here. So to sum up what I was noticing here is that that Ferdowsi definitely has his own style, which is consciously imitated by later poets such as Asadi Tusi and many others. And then from that, you get to the Hash-Behesht and the Half-Pekar stories and the Alexander stories. And so if we're using the concept of story worlds, you can maybe identify certain kind of worlds out there that various authors partake in. There's the Shāhnāma story world, then the Alexander and Bahram Gur story worlds, these heroes that go off exploring and having adventures. Then the kind of Viso-Ramin, Khosrow Shirin story worlds of the courtly romance. And then the kind of more metaphysical, shall we say, explorations of romance in stories like Layli Majnun and Yusuf and Zulaykha. And then further down from that, you get even more fragmented narratives where it's not so much about like a single piece, but rather episodic short performance pieces like the Feraknames, the Dahnamehs, the Mahsan al-Asrar, the Matla al-Anvar, and so on. So that's for me, very interesting just to think about that spectrum of generic breakdown. The divan literature clusters as a group, and is probably likely that if you continue this forward into the early modern period, you would see a very different group with early modern poets. The didactic Masnavis are kind of a triangle with romance in the divans, so they're drawing elements from both of those. And in the center, you consistently find Attar, Jāmi, Molana, and Sadi. Interestingly, the Golestan is like dead center on both the 500 and 1,000 word scales, showing that probably because Sadi's Golestan is drawing from so many of these various genres and putting them together. So I think that, again, this is sort of like, duh, we all knew that Golestan was an important work. It is a very good text for offering a good introduction to the grammatical features of classical prose, but teaching the vocabulary that you're likely to encounter in divan literature, the homiletic style of Attar and Molana, and the romances, especially of Layli Majnun and Yusuf and Zulaykha. So it's kind of a best of both worlds, right? If you were to learn classical prose through the Bustan, you get those same grammatical features, but the lexicon is very different. Whereas Sadi gets you that classical prose grammatical stuff along with a vocabulary body that will help you read a lot of poetry. And also, as we know, the Golestan incorporates a ton of Arabic, and so that's a useful place to think about how to best to introduce students to Persian Arabic bilingualism. The works of Jāmi, Anvari, Molanon, and Attar are also good center points. So we don't need to only work with Sadi if we don't want to. But if students want to work with epic, they are probably better off not using Sadi. They would be best off working with the Shāhnāma, or maybe something closer to the center, like the Alexander stories or Visuramin. Although maybe the Bustan could work as well, because it uses the same meter. And it has some famous passages where it imitates the style of Ferdowsi. So Golestan is great for prose and grammar, but if you are more of a, say, cultural historian and you want to read a lot of travel literature or philosophy or history, you may not be that, you won't get that much out of the Golestan. That might merit a different set of texts to act as your starting point. I spoke a whole lot there. I hope that wasn't tiring. But I think that's basically what I wanted to say. I'm going to now, basically the short and sweet of it is that Golestan seems to be an excellent teaching text. And thankfully we have a lot of helpful resources in addition to the stylometric stuff that we can use. Ganjur gives us a breakdown of the most common meters that you'd find in the Golestan. So that's where you can isolate, the top 5 meters to know and just have down by heart. It gives you lists of the most common words outside of prepositions and pronouns and that sort of thing. So there you quickly get your 1,000 most common words, along with your most common verbs like goftan, kardan, didan, alvordan, and so on. And you can also use stylo to identify a lot of common idioms and phrases, such as badazan, ruzo shab, niko bad, chunin dad pasoch, John Odell, marura, hardo adam, taj o tacht, as harsu, and so on, and things like that. So you could, there's a lot of potential here for getting students set up and running quickly to start reading classical Persian through this text. This is where I'll stop because the idea that we'll be doing now, or we're sharing with you now, is like, what would this look like in practice? And Matt had referred to his experiments with teaching Ferdowsi through frequency-based readers. And I think you'll find it really interesting to see how can we use a frequency-based approach to pedagogy to maybe identify passages in the Golestan that we might use as a baseline or as a starting point for getting students up and running. So,
Kim,
yeah.
Would you actually mind going back to the last slide real quick? Because I just want to say a couple of things reflecting on some of the questions that were in the chat and comments that are related.
Oh, I see a lot of chat questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, and actually I didn't think about this necessarily as part of this presentation, but I think there's a series of questions about kind of the corpus and the corpus construction, and it may be good for me to reiterate some of what I was typing in the chat, but then also just say a broader point about kind of the comparison between like what Ganjur is doing and like what we're doing and how that may impact things moving forward. So first of all, the reason that there's not as many prose works represented in the kind of the mini corpus that Cam was working with in his explorations with Stylo is because when we did the Persian Digital Library pilot project, there were not that many prose texts in Ganjur or in any of these other. There's a few other kind of digital text repositories out there. And so that was actually one of the reasons that we at Roshan Institute launched into this whole, what has now become 6-7 year detour into developing OCR and HTR software for Arabic script languages, Persian, Arabic, Ottoman, Turkish, and Urdu, was because we said, okay, look, the Ganjur corpus that was available then was, as Cam said, heavily based in kind of poetry, divan tradition of classical Persian. what Ganjur has done is in many ways incredible. It's incredibly useful. The person behind it is a wonderful gentleman who has been very collaborative and puts all this energy and work into creating this resource that I know many people use for many different reasons. And since then, he has added a lot of other text, including many more prose text. So if we redid the Persian Digital Library pilot at this point, there would be much more prose in here. But that being said, there are some issues with the way Ganjur sometimes approaches textual editing, for example, that make it difficult to use as a scholarly source. So, for example, they often merge together editions, like they create almost kind of like Ganjur critical editions or Ganjur editions, which is fine. That is a long, long practiced, textual practice going back, hundreds of years. All sorts of different manuscript editors created different editions for different reasons. And so I don't think we should think ill of it for that, but we do have to be very cognizant that those texts are, in many senses, their own edition. So one of the things that we are trying to do is actually create what we would call, scholarly verified digital texts. We will be through the Open Islamic Text Initiative, Mellon Foundation funded project over the next year or so, releasing probably on the order of 4,000 to 5,000 new Persian and Arabic texts, probably about 2,000 new Persian texts that we'll be able to add now to what we call the Open ITI corpus. If a year from now, Cam was doing this work with Stylo, it could look very different. It would also look very overwhelming. There'd be so many new texts then. But at the same time, this is just to point to the fact that this is an evolving project in many ways, both the work that Cam and I are doing together and also actually getting Persian literature into the digital space in ways that are consistent with international scholarly standards for text editing. So there's a very rich field of digital text standard development for, around the world. And one of the things that we're doing is actually trying to bring the Persian tradition into alignment with those text standards, so we can easily take all these new texts and have scholars like Cam be able to just download them and use them for work with Silo or for their own work with this high frequency script that I'll talk about in a second that Maxime Romanov and I used to create what I'll show you here in just a second. But that process is very complex, actually. It sounds simple, but it actually is very difficult to do in practice. Happy to talk more about that in the Q&A if you want, but because we're 1 minute from the hour, let me just very quickly show you and walk you through what we did here. Okay, here it is. All right, can you all see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So a while ago, we decided to focus on the Shāhnāma, which is kind of funny because, as Cam said earlier, probably that was not actually the best thing to start out with. But, we decided to take that work and actually run it through Maxime Romanov's high frequency reader script. So a piece of software that would pore over the text and create very complex series of tables that would identify what are the most common features in this text as a whole. So the idea behind this is you have a new Persian learner who has some degree of Persian training, and they really want to be able to start reading the Shāhnāma because, although they've taken 2 or 3 years of modern Persian, they've always really wanted to read the Shāhnāma in the original. They've really wanted to dip into the classical pre-modern Persian tradition. So we say, okay, well, we could just start with the opening of the Shāhnāma and have them kind of gradually start to work through it. And that is something that I'm sure many of us at different points in our Persian education may have experienced. We also could take the entire text of the Shāhnāma, run it through the script, and identify, the 10, 15, whatever, 20 most common passages that contain the vocabulary and grammatical features that are most representative of the entire Shāhnāma, and build lessons around them that will then allow that language learner to be able to learn and identify what are the things that they most need to know to be able to successfully start from the very beginning of the Shāhnāma and read it all the way through within a year or two. So this was the kind of idea behind this, and what I created, and Cam, I believe you said you used this with your students, right?
I did, yeah.
So maybe you can say a little bit about what that experience was like from the student perspective. But I worked with Maxime on running the script, and then I kind of wrote it up. I took the passage, which is actually a selection from the story of Sauvage, this selection right here, which is short enough that a very early learner can make their way through it in a reasonable amount of time, not be completely overwhelmed by the scale of it, but then using the kind of contextual information that's provided in English that situates it within the broader work. And then also, as you'll see below, kind of situates it, culturally, start to learn how to make their way through this text. So you'll see here the kind of reading at the center, but then you'll see a list of vocabulary, the most high frequency vocabulary features. You'll notice that one of the things that immediately shows up are certain contractions that they may not be familiar with from learning modern Persian. Certain more archaic, vocabulary for words that they probably know in modern Persian if they've spent a few years learning Persian already, but they may not know some of the more archaic words, which, especially in the case of Ferdowsi, is an even, more significant issue. So they start to learn some of the most important vocabulary, the most common vocabulary that they'll find in all stories. And then, we ask them to actually kind of struggle to learn some of the vocabulary. So some of the words we ask them to learn by context. So after they've done a few passes through the reading itself, after we've given them some of the most important vocabulary, ask them then to kind of push themselves and struggle through some of the other vocabulary that they may not know. Ask them to do some reading comprehension, and also give them, as Cam was saying before, some of the really important points of grammar, the differences, the things that they would not necessarily know if they were coming out of second year Persian, for example. So many of the ones that Cam mentioned are in this kind of write-up. I included also a cultural section to this as a way of kind of tying it together and building up their knowledge, both of the pre-modern tradition, but perhaps helping them connect it to things that they may be familiar with in the modern story, and then in modern Iranian history. And then lastly, something that I personally feel very strongly about is somebody who's increasingly working in handwritten text recognition technology, working with the manuscript tradition, paleography. So I think this is something that is really important, skill that is not systematically taught in many graduate programs. And often it's kind of an acquired skill that one gets on their own by just reading enough and asking, somebody who has some expertise in it. But I really would actually like to see it more systematically incorporated into Persian, pre-modern Persian language learning. And then some questions for further study. I won't, belabor this whole thing. The one thing that I will mention that I did not include here that Cam mentioned and I think would need to be included as we develop this project and expand it and do it with other figures like Sadi is poetic meter. I mean, I think that's a huge and really important part that I just did not include in this. Anyways, we're a little over time, and I think we definitely want to make sure we have time for Q&A. So I will stop here. But yeah, I don't know, Cam, did you want to make any concluding comments or comment on your use of this in your class as students at University of Michigan? If there's anything noteworthy?
I will only say that my students really loved it. They thought like, oh, this is great. And asked me why I didn't have more of this for the other authors we were reading. So at least from that very, very singular test case, it seems to have been it seems to have had a favorable reception. But yeah, I mean, this is where we're at with this idea, and I think what would be better than anything else would be to talk about it and hear what you have to say. I think we would. Your feedback and suggestions about how best to approach this, whether from the large scale thing around, thinking about multiple, I think what came out in the chat and also my own prefatory remarks is that no, you can't have like a single key to unlock Persian literature. It's too big, right? Golestan and Sadi are good for a certain very well known range of Persian poets, both, and it also covers a lot of well-known genres, from the homiletic to the romantic, and the didactic is sort of all kind of there. But yeah, like probably something like this could be used to further identify, if you're really interested in Tascade, for example, what would be a good starting text or a group of texts? What would be, if you're interested in philosophy, a challenging genre in its own right, where would you start? So there's that's like the big scale issue if we're thinking big. And then how to teach Sadi himself. I mean, I'm sort of imagining, because you find so many short hekayats in the Golestan and Zad wa Masalha. It seems like an obvious place to look, but running the script through the corpus would probably produce really interesting passages to use in the way that Matt was describing. But I'd love to hear what you all think as far as how to best continue with this work.
Just Cam, something you said just reminded me. I mean, I think ideally, this could best be done in kind of a genre by genre format, in the sense that, and I think we're all aware of this to some degree as Persian language learners. Like you can develop really high level skills in reading a particular genre, and you can pick up those texts and it's just crystal clear. And then you can jump to another genre that contains extremely different vocabulary, or is just very different in its kind of the conceptual terminology that it uses, or and it can be a very disorienting experience when you're learning another language. And so I think there's also a way in which these could not just be for like beginning learners, but they could also be for learners who maybe they can read Persian poetry or Persian, chronicles really well, but they want to actually move into, reading, philosophical texts or Sufi treatises or something like that. And all of a sudden they just feel, like they're reading another language because they aren't acquainted with all the terminology or, potentially other generic conventions. So I think ideally it would be wonderful to do it in a genre by genre way. Obviously this is a huge project. And as I told Cam many times, like I think we would actually really need to get some sort of grant to do this, and to do this as a team with scholars working in different areas that they have a specialty in, and that they can actually write these kind of primers for. The last thing I would say is that as I've thought about this in kind of preparation for this presentation, the one thing that's really come to my mind is that actually I think this would be much better done digitally, because many of the kind of like most common pre-modern grammatical features, for example, you're going to see pop up in all sorts of different texts. And so you don't necessarily want to create like one text. You want to actually be able to, I think, pull modules in from different places, some type of module on, raw, for example, that you could pull into multiple places based on, based on when it shows up, if you're reading romantic epic or Sufi treatise, version or something like that. So anyways, I will be quiet so you all can ask some questions.
Thank you so much for your wonderful, informative talks. This was a topic that is very close to my heart, and I actually felt the need of such a book, because the only one, or actually the most recent one is this one, right? A Millennium of Classical Persian Poetry by Thaxton, which is quite dated and it doesn't have any exercises. And I was hoping for work like this to emerge. Actually, I did some domain analysis with the University of Chicago, and then me and my colleague Behruz Mahmoudi Bakhtiari, University of Tehran, are developing a textbook, but just focusing on the prose classical Persian, and it's going to come out next year. But I'm very happy to hear that you are working on this. I just wanted to mention a few things, and then I will open the floor for further questions. I think we have to also think what is pedagogically feasible to do, because I think combining prose and poetry and combining all the genres in both of them, it's kind of a huge task, and I don't know how much doable it will be. As far as the frequency is concerned, it's very good for research, like Corey Miller, the Frequency Dictionary of Persian. If you look at it on page 3 or 4, it's written unvan higher than chand. But in my classes, I come from a linguistics and applied linguistic background. I know that chant has to be taught much before unvan. So some things that are teachable, or let's say the level of difficulty of teaching, is not necessarily corresponding with the difficulty of level of difficulty of learning. So we have to always think about what is easy for students to acquire. So when you mentioned, for example, you don't think chronological order is sound for your project, I was wondering how thematical order is, because they can still be a lot, like difficult to learn texts, even if you put them thematically. And I didn't hear any exercises mentioned. I was wondering if this book is just a reader, or if it's like a textbook, because before we started, Kamran said that it's going to be a textbook, and a textbook needs exercises. So perhaps if you want, like Matt's idea that you ask other people in different, disciplines to work together and to make a digital textbook, that is very feasible. I would like to mention Professor Franklin Lewis, who told me that his wish is for everybody in pedagogy, Persian pedagogy, to get together and write a textbook, but online, so that everybody can contribute to at every moment, like during the time. So, and I'm very happy that Furuzan Lewis is here. So I think I'm going to stop, because otherwise I have a lot to talk about this. Maybe we can talk about it later, but I will ask other people. Or actually, maybe I give you a chance to respond, and then I will ask other questions.
I think these are all great suggestions. I'll leave it at that because I feel like We want to. I'd like to hear from everyone else as much as possible. But I think that all the suggestions you raised speak to Matt's point about a digital platform being a really logical place, because that allows for exercise creation and also things like recitations, right? Or you could take the thing in like the passage and then show it in various manuscript forms to practice paleography. So anything that allows like audio components to be added make a lot of sense.
Exactly. And if it's online, then it's like genre based, and then you have a series of texts, and based on the success of the students, whoever is reading it, they can read the easier one, and then they can move to the next one with a higher level of difficulty. But it's an amazing project. I'm very happy you're working on it. Professor Talaqani, you can ask your question.
Oh, thank you, Puneja. I want to say that this is a fascinating project. This is something that I think it's a huge project. It's a lot of work, and you two guys did a great job so far. But as Matt and also Pune mentioned, you really need a team. Honestly, each part of that is very, very difficult to until the end of the project. I know that you need a budget and so on. For example, for the grammar part, because it's part of my job, I think you really need a linguist, a person that can show how, specifically because it's corpus, it's very good. Through this, you teach the grammar, but at the same time, a linguist can help you that explain what chronologically happened to Ra. This is something that's very, very important. It's for your project and for these students who wants to learn. They already knew what's Ra, and now they see different representation and what happened to Ra. On the other hand, as Pune mentioned, writing the exercise for this digital text, it's a huge task because it should be task-based. It's something that I think a group of the people who has the knowledge of writing the exercise with the idea of how pedagogically challenge the students, not just by the text, by understanding the text. You have a couple of questions over there that I love that Matt shared with us. It's very good because somehow you can bridge between the cultural awareness and linguistic knowledge through the classic literature. This is something that I love about the literature because it's not just for teaching the linguistic skill, it's good for cultural awareness too. And I think that's fabulous. And I don't know what to say. I just wanted to say that I wish that you just explain more instead of we are talking. But thank you so much. Thank you so much for this.
Would you like to respond, or should I move to the next one?
Yeah, please go ahead. I mean, I completely feel that point very deeply. I remember when writing those like kind of poor excuses at exercises and questions, I was just thinking of, my colleagues Nahal and Ali here at University of Maryland, and how deeply they think about these kind of things as like Persian language pedagogues. And, Cam and I are really literature professors. So we could definitely benefit a lot from, I think, working with somebody who really does Persian language pedagogy and really deeply thinks about how do you learn these things. So I take that point very seriously.
Sad.
Thank you. Taranejan, you're next.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I'm in a cafe. I really loved your talk, and I had to be somewhere like 30 minutes ago, and I didn't go because I loved it so much. So thank you so much. You did talk about a lot of things that I actually think about, and my approach to incorporating literature in my Persian language classes. And I just knowing that there is a system now, thank God, and hopefully soon there's going to be a systematic resource that we can actually access. That's amazing. I specifically love how adaptable your system is. Because I have this feeling that in Persian language programs, a lot of the times there's this idea of, oh, like wait for literature, like, you know, you have to do the first year and the second year and the third year, and then maybe literature later. And I really like that it's really flexible and empowering to students who actually want to read literature. I have multiple things I want to talk about, but I will talk about only one because there are a lot of people who have questions. I just had a suggestion for you about the book. I do think that teaching the language and literature as part of the language to heritage speakers and non-heritage speakers is a little different. And I do think that you can add this component specifically for your heritage speaker audience. So for example, what I do with Ferdowsi or like whatever Sadi, whatever poetry specifically that I'm working on is I try to have the heritage speaker students connected with their own knowledge because they a lot of the times they know these words in the spoken form, right? Like I remember a recent one has been from Darandakhtan, and like the way they say it is mindazam or bendazam, right? And I would like just have them try to find the present stem there and then try to use it in like in Persian morphology, then like maybe come up with, okay, tell me what do you think chishman does mean? Because none of them has really heard it. They know manzare and not chishman does. And this is like both helpful to them and also it kind of motivates them to learn the written form of the language because a lot of the times they're like, why do I need to learn the written form? I'm fluent. So I do think that it's an extra component to be added to the book. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Those are brilliant comments to bear in mind. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Professor Kia, Mana Kia.
Hi, thank you so much. This was such a great talk, and I was so excited to come because, you know, I don't work on the medieval context, but Sadi is very important. I've always thought he was incredibly central for kind of teaching the stuff I do teach, which is like a third year, it's understood to be third year or later course on reading Persian texts, and it's usually, you know, 14th, 15th century and later. But I think one of the things, the project is super exciting. I think it would be so helpful, open access. And I just wanted to kind of throw out a couple of comments and questions really around the practicalities of this. So I don't teach first and second year. I'm not a language pedagogue. I have taught this readings course 4 or 5 times. And you know, it's all pre-modern, it's all pre-20th century. And I usually have 5 to 7 students in every class. So it's not a tiny number of students. Some of them do have the range, like Tarana was saying, some of them are people from like Danishgah Tehran, right? Like there are people who grew up in Iran and did their BA there, and then they come, but they haven't read any of these texts, especially the kind of middle period stuff. And you know, I take the point that Matt made about Ganjur. Ganjur has more stuff, but it's still very selective, and it's always been very puzzling to me what they include and what they don't include and why. And I guess for me, the challenges have been that language learning, and I don't know if this is the same, if this is something at Columbia, it's specific to the United States, maybe it's not the same in Canada, which is that the way in which language pedagogy is evaluated is very much on the kind of post-World War II system that assumed that you were going to go do study abroad in these places and emphasize certain skills that we can't assume that the majority of our students necessarily can do. Like if they're new language learners and they're US citizens, they're probably not going to Iran for study abroad, right? And if they're Iranian, they don't need to be taught how to learn to speak modern Persian. And so, you have this kind of rock and a hard place where you're training students who maybe know modern Persian but need to learn classical Persian, or are never, like, you want them to be able to basically speak, but they're not probably anytime in the near future going to go and order ice cream in Tehran. Right. And so this has been like a difficult thing of like the unlearning that you talk about, and and they come from first and second year Persian. I find with what I understand to be very weak reading and writing, I don't actually emphasize writing skills that much, but like the reading skills are very weak. And the classical is sort of de-emphasized because of the way language lectures are evaluated by the university. And so it's really helpful for those of us that are teaching like the more advanced courses to have something that has in mind the way in which language lectures are evaluated and the way that we need to intervene when we're teaching them. And Pune showed Wheeler Thaxton's intermediate text, but he has an intro text that does have a chapter on some of the differences, although it's a very small chapter. I really wish it was bigger. And I love the idea of using the Golestan and talking about morphological and grammatical and vocabulary differences. Just having a resource or doing that instead of being like, no, that's not what you think it is, it's this, would be so helpful. And I would love that. I wish that something that is quote unquote called post-classical also wouldn't be entirely excluded.
Yeah, totally. I think that you raised, like, both points are equally valid, right? Like, Golestan is such a touchstone that it's helpful to know, even if you end up working in periods that are fairly distant from it, right? Because like it's such a touchstone. Like, you find quotations from it, or you find it embroidered on rugs. Like it's just good to know, right? At the same time, it's not necessarily going to enable you to read early modern, or like say anything from 1600 beyond. Things really change quite a lot. I mean, like, as you saw from the corpus, again, I was relying on, I actually could have brought in a few more 18th, 19th century poets. Yeah, I'll continue to sort of play around and see what pops out. But it seems, even from these preliminary scans, that Saed, remember, like, he's so different from anyone before him. That, yeah, if you wanted to focus on that period, then it's important to develop like its own specialized curriculum, probably. So Golestan is like helpful as sort of a midpoint. You can't use Golestan to really master Ferdowsi, but it's an important text to go backwards in time from. And you can't really use Golestan to master Bidel, but you can. It's still a useful text touchstone to sort of build on from. So that might be the kind of broad plan if we were thinking, in this kind of idealistic way of like, what would we ideally have, to say that Golestan's worth knowing regardless of where you're at. So it's a useful text to build a program out of, in addition to Hamrah ba, other primers or introductory texts to help you get familiar with other genres, periods, and so on.
Thank you. Professor Keshavarz, you may ask your question.
Yes, hi. I really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you very much, both. I think that's a great project. And, as I think Dr. Talghani mentioned, you should not hesitate to ask others to get in and just play their parts. And I think people would be willing to do that. I want to make a few general points that I'm not sure how, that I think it just may over time come useful. And I'm just going to go in the order of less significant to what I think, at least to me at this moment, seems more significant. One is that Ganjur has just a tremendous amount of errors. It just has not had any proper editing. So while it's really good, I've recently started with my husband reading some of the classics, and it's just out of curiosity we're using Ganjur because the books are sitting there. And it's just we have the books just to, when we just think that, oh, this doesn't work, and then you find that this isn't really what it should be. So at least it should be something that would be on our radar screen as we read that. Then I think that students who come from the heritage community, there's some of you pointed out some of the issues that they deal with, and they really need to handle in speech and all that. But they are desperately in need of learning how to write. And those of them who want to go a little bit further, they constantly ask for something that helps for writing. Again, I mean, I don't know how this is going to fit into the project, but something that came to my mind. Another point is that, yes, Iranians right now, as Mana mentioned, are not going to, the learners here are not going to go to Tehran and buy ice cream, but if they ever speak with an Iranian who's been learning Persian in Iran, it's going to be just filled with references that come out of nowhere from literature, like, you know, این رشته سر دراز دارد, and then you go on to say something else, or تو برای وصل کردن آمدی, or something like that. So there is a huge amount of overlap between the classic and the current living, but using Persian as a live medium, that is both makes things a little difficult, but also easy, because, you know, as you're teaching all those classical stuff, that's important. That's also true of generic forms. I think yes, Johns are very different, but at the same time, you know, Masnavi has some of the most lyrical and ghazal-like pieces incorporated in various places. So this kind of overlap could be helpful in picking things up that could help the students see the overlap, but also learn in two different directions of prose and poetry, as well as poetic and non-poetic. And then last thing I want to say is that I cannot emphasize enough long-term immersion for literature, because context is everything. Now, Matt, who's disappeared from the screen because probably the kids need attention after 2:30, we spent 2 years after PhD was done, job was taken, 2 years only Friday mornings, every morning, reading between 2 to 4 ghazals. And it was his stamina. I was happy to do it. I was delighted to do it. But there is no other way, really. So I wonder if this kind of immersion can ever be added somehow by having digital connection with Iran. That's the one kind of connection that is possible with Iran. And Iranians are very savvy in that. So I wonder if there could be something in this, worked into this, that could bring in more of an excitement, so that the students think, oh, I can have this connection. Let me see what I can learn there. And thank you so much for doing what you're doing.
Well, thank you. Matt, do you...
Yeah, I mean, I would...
Oh, you're here!
Yeah. I'm here. Although the kids might come in from their last activity very soon, and it'll sound like a tornado is coming. No, I mean, I think, like, to your last point, I mean, my concern actually is that I wonder if like we'll be able to replicate that model moving forward, like just what you were pointing to, like this like incredibly intensive for you in particular model where we sat and read hundreds, thousands of things, you know, to like I don't know. I don't know if the kind of institutional culture and the amount of demands and expectations on faculty moving forward, like if that is going to be a model that is going to be able to be replicable moving forward, which is partly what motivates, it's part of what motivates, at least me. I mean, I won't speak on behalf of Cam, but like figuring out ways to give students resources who maybe aren't, you know, at a university where someone is willing to do that. Because I mean, although you were incredibly generous in doing that, I don't know. I don't know that that's possible in many places. And yeah, maybe through some type of program with Iran, it would be possible. Although, I mean, I of course would want to pay those people in Iran, and I can tell you from trying to.
Can I have a quick follow-up? I think payment comes to it. It is not going to work with the issue unless we have a lot of other political issues resolved.
No,
but Iranians, I promise you, you will find more volunteers and more persistent people who want to do that. And by the way, I did it to give a Matt Miller to Persian studies because I thought that you were doing it and you could do it, and that would be the service I can do. But I know that's why I think digital connection with Iran could be some way to address that. Sorry, I'll stop talking.
Yeah, and hence a digital platform is helpful, right? I mean, it's no silly online manual can be any substitute for one-on-one conversations. But if it's there and people can use that to connect and network, potentially forming those kind of reading groups that for the same way that have historically formed for Middle Persian and Old Persian. Why not with colleagues and friends in Iran? Like that'd be lovely. So if it's kind of like this humble, you know, offering that may offer a starting point for various use cases. You know, yeah,
great starting point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and your point about proverbs is excellent. I mean, I think that's one thing to kind of think about in design and when selecting pieces. If going back to Sadi, for example, if certain Zaro masalhas that appear in the Golestan, masalan, right? Like you can find them. Pick a text, you'll find interesting things that continue to circulate. But yeah, I'd say like let's highlight this one. And say, okay, memorize this because you can use it. Here's some ways you can use it in modern speech and contemporary speech. That's another kind of khadmat kuchika that such a reader can offer.
Thank you. We're already 10 minutes over the time, but Jane, can you ask a quick question and then we have a quick answer and we round it up today?
Yeah,
I'm more too. Sorry.
Well, it goes without saying, fantastic talk, and thank you, Matt and Kamran, for all the work you're doing. But my question is, have you looked into the role of music in teaching Persian, classical Persian? I mean, the correspondence between the various gouchets and the various meters is extremely strong, and that's the way the gouchets were taught traditionally. And it's very helpful for understanding you could, if you're just reading the words but you don't know the rhythm, you can miss a lot of the meaning. And so using Persian music and the various gouchets, and if you want some suggestions on how that can be done, I can always be in touch. And I have 1,000 suggestions, Kamran. When you come to England, hopefully we'll get together and we can discuss all these things.
That'd be marvelous. Yeah, I mean, not just recitations, but yeah, like sung performances of these would be just absolutely magnificent. Because yeah, I mean, things like for me too, like learning meter was facilitated by thinking of it musically and hearing like the Neem Fatehs, for example, enunciated, tapping it out as I was listening to a thing. So yeah, that's the materials are there, and your input would be just fantastic. And finding particular pieces to accompany particular works. To aid students in not just like cognitively understanding the concept of meter, but hearing it in practice so that they can internalize it with their hearts as much as with their minds. Be amazing.
Cam, Amar is our PhD student, and it's nice to hear from the perspective of a student if they have a question. So if you guys don't mind just staying for a little bit more. Amar, go ahead. You can ask your question.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. I just I actually had like 3 questions, but I'll shorten them. Yes. I guess my question is, in your cluster analysis, Saadi's Golestan as a prose work was kind of different than Saadi's Divan, for instance. And I was wondering, within the Divan, like all the different forms, Rubaiyat and Azaz, is there a variance between them if you conduct like a tripartite cluster analysis for each of these different forms? And the secondary question that follows from there is, would you suggest a specific form over another to start with? Because to me it seems like the Rubai is much simpler than, for instance, that Ghazal.
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't share this in the presentation, but I did do like some analyses of the corpus of Saadi himself, just to see. Do you know what falls at the center of Saadi's work? Any guesses?
The Ghazals.
No. The Hadithot.
Oh my goodness! Of course.
You read the Hadithot, you have mastered Saadi. Yeah. So that was always in the dead center, and then all these other things are around it. Yeah. That was really interesting, isn't it? Yeah, if you wanted to offer like an introduction to Saadi, you could start with the Hadithot and then move out from there. Yeah, and this was really interesting about the Golestan, though, and that was one of the points that really popped out to me, is that as a prose work, it also resonates with Fatime's point as well, that form is impactful, but it's not the only factor. Sometimes if depending on the theme you're writing about, that can really create connections and links far beyond the form. Even the genre in some ways. Like take the Layla Majnun. It's generically a love story, but thematically it's very close to like the Max al-Asra, for example. So what I was going to say with that, so what's really interesting about the Golestan is that it's prose, but it reads like a ghazal in terms of its content and themes. So it gives you that kind of double benefit of like you're learning to read classical Persian prose, but it's filled with poetry as well. So you get the poetry. And you're also training yourself in the thematic range and content, sort of that kind of conceptual world, the story world, shall we say, of ghazal poetry alongside the work of somebody like Molana or Nezāmi. That's kind of where this triangle happens. But yeah, like there's more that one can do if you zero down to a particular author, such that apparently the Hadithot is kind of like the place where all of Saadi's themes kind of come up together.
Thank you so much. I'm going to give the floor back to Professor Talaqani.
Thank you so much, Professor Shabani, for moderating the session. Thanks, audiences, for the questions, discussion, comments. And at the end, thank you so much for a wonderful talk, fascinating talk that Matt and Cameron has done for us. And I just wanted to share something. We have the last but not the least of our lecture in literature on Persian language pedagogy by Professor Taraneh Sanei for December 6th. I will share with you the talk, the poster of the talk that as you see, when literature is accessible, authentic materials, language awareness, and teaching Persian in the era of internet and social media. We are looking forward to see you all on December 6th, and back to Professor Tavakkoli for concluding remarks.
Well, thank you very much. I just want to thank Professor Miller and Professor Cross for their inventive and pioneering work and also presentation. I'm particularly looking forward to the 4,000 books that Professor Miller has promised to have digitized and made available. We cheer for you. And if you have students who are unable to go to Tehran to order ice cream, please send them to Tehranto. There are many ice cream places where you can order ice cream in Persian, and so you can be our guest. Have a lovely